A form isn't much good without data. There are three main data operations forms need to be concerned with: the initial load of the data or any default values, validating the data, and saving the data. Two of these, loading and saving, are pretty straightforward from the form's point of view. Really, as far as the form is concerned, it takes in values and displays them in field controls. Then when the user clicks the Save button, takes the values out of the form controls and passes them back to whatever component contains the form. It's that owning component's responsibility to retrieve the data from wherever it's stored, massage it as required into the format expected by the form, and hand it to the form as part of the load process. And then do the reverse as part of the save process. Receive the data from the form, convert it to the format required by the storage medium, and pass it over to be stored. The form's involvement is pretty thin for each of these. The only place the form really has to do much work is in the validation phase. Fortunately, Angular gives us a lot to work with there, so even that's pretty slim. We're going to take a look at all three data operations in our demo, but we're going to start with loading and saving, and then tackle validation on its own. Taking a look at the load process for our form and how we go about getting the values into the appropriate fields, we're going to start at the bottom and kind of work our way out. So we're starting at the field level itself. But one of the things that you'll notice is that we don't actually do anything with values at the field level. We don't bind the value into a values property on any of our controls. So to see values, we need to start by moving up a level. So we'll move up to our dynamic form. Well, the only thing that dynamic form does, from a data point of view, that we can see here in the HTML, is we have our data observable. And that's just used to control whether or not we're going to display the form or whether we're going to overlay that modal loading message. So let's take a look at the code and see what happens with the data observable. So the data observable is actually created on line 33, but you'll notice on line 29 it's working within something called the values observable. Now we'll take a look at where values observable is set up, but if we scroll up here, you'll see that the value observable is an input that's passed into our form. So we know that that's going to come from the parent widget component. Once that values observable is complete, we're going to start working with the values that are inside there. So we cast it to a promise, so we can just wait until it's totally done, until complete has been called on that observable. And then we're going to have a values object, which is an array of key value pairs, the key being the name of a field, and the value being the value for that field. So we set up a temporary holding area called form values, and then we create our data observable. We iterate through the fields collection for each field on our form, and we grab its value out of the values array that was passed into us. We check to see whether or not we have a value. If we don't, then we're going to either use the default value specified for the field, or we're going to use a null if there's no default value specified. And this is important because ultimately we're going to call setValue down on line 43 and pass in this form values object that we're creating. And setValue is going to require that every field in our form be represented in that form values object. So there has to be a property with the name of the field in that form values. So we want to make sure that we're touching every field and setting it up on form values. So once we've gone through every field in the fields collection, then we make the call to setValue, pass in the form values, and now we're basically done setting up the values on the form. Calling setValue and passing in that object creates a connection down to each field and sets the value for that field based on what was passed in form values. So now we can call observer.next and observer.complete, and this closes out our data observable. So the loader is going to go away, and we're now going to see the form itself. We now enable the form. It was actually disabled up on line 28. Probably overkill because we have the modal overlay sitting on top of it, but I just wanted to demonstrate how you would disable or enable a form programmatically. So that gets the values into our fields and showing in the UI, but we still need to look at where values observable came from. We know it's an input property, so that means in the call to our dynamic form, we're going to have to pass it in. And sure enough, here in our widget component HTML, we're binding values observable to something called existing vals. Taking a look at the code for that, you can see existing vals is another observable. And here's where I'm simulating getting that data just for the sake of the demo. And I'm setting it up to show how you would wait for data to come back from two different sources that would come back at different times. So the observable for existing vals has two set timeouts inside it, one that resolves in a half a second and one that resolves in a second and a half. It's going to make a call to a get existing data for each one of those timeouts. Down here you can see that the first get existing data returns fields 1 through 4, and get existing data 2 returns fields 5 and 6. So when we're going through the first timeout, we get our existing data back. We're going to assign that into all vals, which is just a temporary holding area I have set up. And then we're going to check to see whether or not we have a value for every field. We do that by comparing the length of the properties on all vals to the length of fields. If they're the same, then we're done. We've gotten a value for every field, so we can complete. Now, in this first case, they're not going to be because we only got fields 1 through 4. Coming down and taking a look at the second timeout, we're going to do the same thing, and we're going to compare the length of all vals, the properties on all vals, to the length of fields. This time they're going to be the same. They're going to match because we've gotten the last two fields. So now we call observer complete. And observer complete is going to fulfill the promise that we're waiting for back here. So now we've seen the process of getting data from our parent component, which is essentially controlling things. And this is what's going to work against the server to retrieve the data and pass it all the way down to the form and ultimately display it inside the fields in the appropriate places. Going the opposite way, saving the data, when the user clicks the Submit button on our form, we have our ng-submit event bound to this form submit. Form submit is set up inside our component file here. Going to check to see whether or not we have a submit handler registered, and we'll take a look at where the submit handler comes in. Then we just need to do a little bit of manipulation to hand the data back with the appropriate name, because we had switched the internal name to make sure there were no spaces when it came into the form. So now going out, we want to make sure that the spaces are put back in. We do that just by referencing the original name value on the internal name object. And then we're going to call that submit handler and pass in the object that we just created with key value pairs of the original name and then the value coming out of the field control. The submit handler is an input property specified on our component. So we take a look at where the component is instantiated, and we can see that we're binding submit handler onto something called form submit. So we take a look at form submit, and we can see all that's doing is writing the values out into the console. As we saw in the first demo where we click on the form submit button and then the values are just written to the console, this is where it happens. And the important thing here is that the functionality for that is handled inside this parent component. The parent component is responsible for connecting to the database, both for loading the data as well as saving the data back. The form just says, here's the data that was in the fields, you do whatever you need with them. It's up to this specific parent component to determine what that is.